Chapter 20. Foreboding Skies. He plodded down the path, looking with some disbelief at the hand that was pulling him along. It was warm and felt nothing like anything else he'd ever held before, but it was. It was nice, he supposed. What's wrong? The girl stopped to look down at him, but the sun was high in the sky and shone too brightly down on them for him to make out her face. And nothing, he said quietly. Where are we? We going? The word we felt alien to him, and he had to say it twice to confirm to his brain that it was indeed the word he was looking for. You said you've never played hide and seek before, right? She said, tucking a length of hair behind her ear. I found a fun place to play it and thought you might like it too. Play? He asked shyly. I've never done that before. With someone else I mean. She laughed. You're so weird. Who's never played with someone else before? When he didn't respond, her smile slowly faded from her face. An odd look flashed across her face. Her mouth began to open, and he squeezed his eyes shut, afraid that she'd say something awful and leave him there like everyone else, when suddenly, another voice called out to them. What are you doing? And who's that? He opened his eyes and saw an older boy walking across the street towards them. He had a curious look on his tanned face. This is the boy my mom's taking care of, said the girl, raising a hand in greeting. She gestured back to him with her other hand. Come on, say hello. Hello. He murmured nervously. Hold on, I know him. Said the boy, leaning right down to stare at his face. He shrunk back. Yeah. He's the one Kayumo's mom told us to stay away from. Really? Why? I dunno, the boy shrugged, crossing his arms behind his head. She got mad at Kayumo for letting him join our game of tag. Why would she? He's just a kid like us. The girl smiled down at him again. Right, Naruto? Naruto's eyes flew open. Faint motes of light was streaming through the half-open window, and for a long minute, he looked up at the ceiling. A tattered string dangled from the lone light fixture, and as he watched, it swayed in an invisible breeze. Only when his heartbeat had slowed down did he get up. As Naruto got to his feet, the thin blanket he'd been sleeping under fell off, and at the soft sound, the others in the room began to stir. Stretching his arms, he silently walked to the window and pushed it open the rest of the way. They had spent the night at Tezuna's seaside house, and from the window, Naruto could see the waves jostling gently against the dock. And just barely, he could hear the sound of seagulls. The first time he'd visited the sea on one of his missions several months back, he had been taken aback at the high-pitched wailing sound. It sounded nothing like the birds around Konoha, and even more startlingly, it was accompanied by the underlying deep crashing noise of the waves as they pounded down on shore. But he'd quickly come to enjoy it. Despite the cacophony of each separate sound, together, they melded together and somehow soothed him. Being near the sea was an experience completely alien to Naruto, having grown up in a landlocked village like Konoha, but somehow, it felt familiar to him, as if he were meeting an old friend. As he stood there now, however, it had the opposite effect. The seagulls calling back and forth to each other sounded like a warning. It made him uneasy and restless. It was a strange and uncomfortable feeling that tingled almost unbearably across the surface of his skin. We need to get out of here, he thought to himself. Sakura's team leader Shirakumo, a stern-faced jonin with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, had turned out to be recovering from a deep leg wound. However, it was healing well, and the jonin would likely be able to move around freely with just a few more days of rest. With that out of the way, there was no real reason for them to stay behind in this country. And after the night's rest, Naruto's mind felt clearer. His worries about Mayu resenting him for ordering her back to Konoha seemed silly to him now. She was not so unreasonable as to completely ignore the voice of reason. Surely she would listen to him with just a little more prodding? Naruto? Called out a drowsed voice. He turned around to see Sai getting to his feet with half-lidded eyes, audibly cracking his neck. Sai was already up and was leaning against a wall with his futon neatly folded beside him, while Sasuke was just beginning to put away his. Next to them was Menma, who seemed to have made it halfway out of his futon before falling asleep again, snoozing lightly as a trickle of drool dribbled down across his chin. As Naruto walked back across the wooden floor to fold his own futon, he suddenly wondered about the fleeting dream he had had. But even as he thought about it, like a receding tide, the details slipped further and further back from his memory, and after a while, he stopped thinking about it at all. Tezuna's daughter, a willowy woman with a heart-shaped face named Tsunami, prepared breakfast with Sakura, while Naruto and the other boys took their turns in the small washroom. Mayu had gone back to Kane's home for the night. Kane's head wound, while not overtly serious, was still affecting her, and they had agreed it would be better for at least one person to always be with her. The breakfast, while predictably involving fish in almost every dish, was delicious, and it was at the breakfast table, two separate tables had to be pushed together to make enough room for all of them, that they met Tazuna's grandson Inari, who turned out to be a gloomy young boy in a dull green jumpsuit. "Isn't he cute?" Tazuna said with a fond look down at the boy, who continued to mechanically spoon fish stew into his mouth. Sitting across the table, Naruto silently paralleled him. "He said we're all going to die," said Menma sourly. Sakura nodded an indignant affirmation beside him. "From what you guys were saying about Zabuza, it doesn't sound too far off," said Rai, as he picked at his plate. "He hated fish. How did you guys escape anyways?" Menma pulled back in his chair with a proud look. "We didn't escape. I almost got him, but some hunter nin finished him off instead." "You almost got him? It was all sensei." Sakura scoffed. "And what held Zabuza in place for him?" Menma jabbed a finger at himself, leaving no room for question. "That's right, my mind transfer jutsu." "Oh, is that what it was? I just thought he'd paused to scratch his butt." "Nope, that was me. Butt scratch and all." It was hard for Naruto to imagine anyone looking as proud as Menma did at that moment. "Are they always like this?" Rai asked Sasuke, who grunted noncommittally into his stew. Suddenly, there was a thumping sound as Inari forcibly put down his utensils. The scattered conversations around the table skidded to a stop, and sliding his chair back, Inari dropped to the floor. Tazuna turned around in his chair. "Where are you going, Inari?" "To look at the ocean from my room." Tsunami wiped her hands on her apron. "What about the rest of your breakfast? You skipped dinner yesterday too." "I'm full." Inari slid the door open and left. Menma and Sakura shared guilty glances while everyone else, except Sai, as usual, averted their gazes. "I'm sorry," said Tazuna after a short silence. He took a heavy sip from his cup. "He's been like that since Kaiza died." With the mood in the room having rapidly plummeted, the rest of the breakfast was quiet. To most everyone's relief, soon after breakfast had ended, Mayu and Kane arrived. While Kane and her estranged in-laws began to awkwardly exchange greetings, Naruto discreetly pulled Mayu away from the bemused spectator crowd. Sliding the door shut behind them, Naruto turned around to see Mayu looking a bit pale. She was playing with her hair again, as she always did when she was nervous. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she said, though her eyes darted to the closed door. "You don't look well. Did something happen?" Naruto critically looked her up and down, but besides the pallor, she seemed fine. "No, I'm fine," Mayu insisted. As if to prove her point, she let go of her hair and crossed her arms across her chest. "What did you want to talk about?" "Mayu. We're going to head back to Konoha today," said Naruto, thinking it'd be best to get straight to the point. Mayu's face fell, but ignoring this, he forged forward. Sakura's team already dealt with the missing nin that attacked, and now that Kane is here with Tazuna and the others, Team Shirakumo can't protect her too. "There's no reason for us to be here. Kane-san only agreed to come here because you guys were here," Mayu said quietly. "And they can't always be watching over everyone. They've got their hands full with Tazuna-san's family." "What do you plan to do, then? Protect Kane for the rest of her life?" Naruto interrupted her. Taking a step closer to her, his voice dropped in volume. "Or are you going to kill Gato?" To her credit, even as her entire face reddened, Mayu did not take a step back, choosing instead to look firmly back at him. "What's the point of escorting someone to their village, only for them to be killed as soon as we leave them? I don't want to just follow the mission details to a T, collect the money, and go back home. I want to do it properly. And I want to do my duty as team leader properly," said Naruto, letting some of the frustration he felt seep into his voice. "You do realize you're putting us all in danger here?" We're always in danger," Mayu said hesitantly. "You're right. But you're asking to risk the lives of our teammates just so you can feel better about yourself," said Naruto harshly, and as soon as the words had left his mouth, he regretted them. Mayu flinched backwards and her gaze dropped to the floor. As the seconds silently ticked by, he rapidly searched through his experiences for words to alleviate the situation. And found nothing. Finally, he added lamely, "It's not like they don't have money. If Kane-san really wanted better bodyguards, she could have paid for a higher level mission." When Mayu didn't respond, Naruto sighed. That could have gone better, he thought to himself. Not wanting to look at Mayu's bowed head, he looked around the room instead, and almost immediately, his gaze landed on the sliding door. His eyes narrowed. He took a silent step forward. And in one quick motion, slid it open. A streak of black flashed out of sight, leaving behind only one lone blonde figure standing awkwardly by the door. Hee. Menma laughed uncomfortably, his eyes rapidly flicking from Mayu's downcast figure to Naruto's blank face. I was just looking for the bathroom. You wouldn't happen to know where it is? Deciding that confrontation wouldn't be worth the time, Naruto pointed a finger in the opposite direction. As he watched the boy scamper away, Naruto considered the streak of black he'd seen. Obviously, someone else had been with Menma, and he was willing to bet his tanto that it had been Rai. But why hadn't he come in and said something? Several seconds passed as Naruto stood still in silent contemplation, and soon, from the other end of the hallway, a pink head popped out. Naruto? Sakura sounded suspicious. What are you doing? Everyone's waiting. Sorry, he said. Looking back at Mayu, he gestured toward her. Come on. Mayu mutely bobbed her head and followed him back to the room where everyone else, except Menma, was gathered. Some of the ice seemed to have been broken, though Kane had made a point of sitting on the opposite side of the room from Tazuna. Naruto caught Rai's gaze, but the other boy only flashed him a grin before returning to his apparently all-consuming task of flattening out the creases of his pants. How are you feeling, Kane-san? Sakura asked as everyone settled into their cushions. You look better than you did yesterday, but… Kane slightly bowed her head. It was a slight concussion. I just needed some bed rest. I'm fine now, thank you. Quite the luck she's got there, said Sai, a small smile playing at his lips. Although judging by how they attacked, I don't think the assailants were trying to kill her. No. They were only warning me, Kane said in an odd voice. Her eyes hardened as she looked around at the room's occupants before coming to a rest on Naruto. Now, getting to the matter of business today. Naruto, have you reached a decision as to your team's next action? Naruto paused, quickly looking at each of his teammates in turn. Sitting nearby, Sai looked neutrally back, farther away, Rai, with an unusually serious look on his face, looked down at the ground, and Mayu, on the opposite end of the room, looked straight at him with a creased brow. Before that, I'd like to hear what Team Shirakumo intends on doing, he said. With that, everyone looked at the Jonin, who was currently resting his splinted leg across two cushions. As Shirakumo opened his mouth to speak, a conflicted expression quickly flitted across his face. 3 days ago, I sent a missive to the Hokage explaining the current situation and requesting further orders. While I await his reply, we are on standby. Noticing Tazuna's downcast expression, he hastened to add, personally, I feel that it is our duty as ninja to deal with any immediate dangers that risk the safety of our client. However, the ultimate decision is in the hands of our village. That is the best I can offer you. That's already more than enough, Tazuna grunted. What I don't understand is why you need our help, Sasuke suddenly spoke up, surprising Naruto. The Uchiha boy, while not exactly taciturn, had not struck him as the type to take initiative unless the situation absolutely called for it. Kane turned coolly towards him. What do you mean? You clearly have at least some money, as you've been funding the bridge's construction. Why rely on us instead of properly hiring ninja to deal with the matters here? Or are your pockets not deep enough? Kane opened her mouth and then closed it. Her hesitation was painfully obvious. However, in gratitude for saving my life, I do owe you all some answers, she said slowly. And even if you cannot help us, I have confidence. Or hope that you will not turn on us. Kane closed her eyes. The Wave Country's daimyo is in Gato's hands. We cannot raise any form of direct rebellion against Gato, and hiring any ninja above Chunin level would be received as such. At her words, Tazuna's face went taut with surprise. What do you mean in Gato's hands? Is he being kept physically captive? Naruto asked, intrigued against his will. From what we know of our last reports, the daimyo and his immediate family are all being kept in house arrest inside their main residence, Kane confirmed. And you can't just assassinate Gato? Rai piped up, looking confused. Oh, we've tried, said Kane bitterly. But the assassination attempt failed, and Gato killed Lady Awa, the daimyo's wife, in retaliation. The daimyo then made a public renunciation, labeling the actions of any who dared to defy Gato as mutiny. Who is this we you're talking about? Sasuke pressed and then looked meaningfully at Tazuna, who seemed to now be making a passable imitation of a guppy. It can't be the bridge builders. Just a group of the last couple of stragglers with a backbone left in this country, said Kane with a venomous look. Rai scratched his chin. But you haven't tried again since your first failure? Don't you think you gave up too soon? Kane shook her head. You don't understand. Why do you think I was in Konoha? Why do you think I've been traveling around the nations? To sell things? I've been arranging meetings with the Kage of various hidden villages with the aim of making an alliance between theirs and Wave Country. But almost every nation has turned me down. Including Fire Country. Really? Sakura looked perplexed. But wouldn't an alliance benefit us? It'd bring more trade into our country. Not necessarily. Said Shirakumo gravely, his arms crossed across his chest. Until now, he had remained silent with a neutral expression fixed on his face, but it seemed he had reached some sort of decision. As it stands now, Gato's shipping ventures benefit all of the neighboring countries. There are no tariffs or regulations in place along the coastline, making it an excellent waypoint for maritime trade with farther and wealthier nations, such as Water and Tea Country. And Gato is making this possible by taking the money directly out of the citizens' taxes. Yes, Gato knows what he's doing. Kane nodded. He's a parasite, and so long as his actions don't harm the other nations, nobody will lift a finger. Because ultimately, Wave Country was never powerful or unified to begin with. If Gato were removed from power, there would be an economic vacuum. The few markets that exist would fall into chaos, and none of the other nations want to risk that. The only nation that would pay attention to my proposals was Lightning Country, and their condition was that they be granted complete control over Wave Country's economy. And what did you say in response? Naruto asked. Kane gave him a thin smile. That I did not have the authority to make such a decision. Despite himself, Naruto felt respect for the sharp-tongued woman virgin inside him. She was clearly doing everything within her power and beyond for the sake of a country that she hadn't even been born to. For a moment, he wondered if it was revenge for her brother that pushed her, but immediately dismissed it. If retribution had been her sole aim, Kane would have arranged for Gato's assassination, damn all the consequences. Instead, she was clearly thinking for the benefit of the nation rather than her own gratification, even at the risk of her own life. However, no matter how pretty her goals were, in the end, they weren't his business, nor was he interested in making them his. Tsunami was refilling everyone's teacups, and as he politely declined his cup, Naruto looked directly at Mayu. Surely she would understand? They were ninjas. They weren't heroes. At his pointed stare, Mayu turned pink, and she opened her mouth. When with a loud bang, the door slid open to reveal a blonde figure. Menma, where have you been? Sakura asked in a scolding tone as she got to her feet. Ignoring her, Menma brandished a sealed scroll in his hand. I've got it. The Hokage's response to Shirakumo-sensei's missive. A messenger Jonin found me at the docks. Immediately, Shirakumo raised his hand and Menma handed it to him. With bated breaths, everyone watched as he unfurled the scroll. For several minutes, it was quiet. Naruto closely observed Shirakumo's face as his eyes rapidly moved across the scroll paper, but as expected of the Jonin, his expression gave nothing away. When Shirakumo finally spoke, however, the note of disbelief in his voice was clear. My team and any other Leaf teams in the vicinity have been ordered by the Hokage to remain in Wave Country and to do whatever is necessary to guarantee the safety of our clients, he said slowly, and Naruto felt his eyes widen. The uneasy buzzing tension was back, sending alarms ringing in his head. Looking up from the scroll, Shirakumo locked gazes with him. The Hokage's seal is on it. So, Kane said softly. What will your team be doing, Naruto? Kakashi POV. Look, I've really gotta make my next delivery, said the Takebetsu Jonin, scowling back at Kakashi. While messenger birds were commonly used within the village walls and on occasion by mobilized teams to send messages back to the village, Takebetsu Jonin specializing as messengers were used to deliver important and direct missives from the Hokage to teams stationed in faraway regions. Kakashi had spotted the messenger slipping away from the house that Naruto and the others were currently in and feeling in his gut that something was off, immediately pounced on him in the neighboring forest. What was that message you delivered? Kakashi pressed, shoving the Jonin more roughly against the tree. I told you, I don't know. I'm just a messenger. The Jonin protested, putting his hands up. Kakashi noticed that he was young for a messenger Jonin. He didn't recall seeing him around the village either, but that was becoming more and more common these days as he spent so much time outside the village walls on extended missions. It was from the Hokage. That's funny, said Kakashi, with a look that suggested he found it anything but. I just exchanged messages with him several days ago. You'd think he'd tell me about such a thing. The Jonin shrugged. Kage's minds work differently from ours. Mere ninja like us can't hope to understand them, he said sagely. And anyways, the Hokage's seal was on it. Kakashi paused. Did you receive it directly from the Hokage himself? No, I picked it up in Water Country at the waypoint, said the Jonin, still struggling to free himself. Look, I'm behind in my deliveries as it is, and I kinda wanna get back home by the end of this week. Reaching a decision, Kakashi let him go, and the Jonin straightened. Muttering darkly to himself, the Jonin stretched back his shoulders before leaping nimbly away and disappearing from sight. He didn't like this. Why would the Hokage send a separate message to Naruto and the others while neglecting to tell him? And why send it all the way to Water Country first, instead of sending a direct messenger? Sure, there were many more messengers going between Water and Fire countries, but still, either the Hokage was up to something, or it was extremely unlikely, but even the Hokage's seal could be faked by a powerful Fuinjutsu master. Now, Kakashi found himself with a dilemma. He had to know what that message had said. But at the same time, he couldn't get any closer to the house or he would be detected. And if it turned out to really be from the Hokage, then he'd have effectively failed his own mission of observing Naruto from afar for nothing. Uncomfortably, Kakashi folded his arms across his chest. He'd give it a day to see what happened. Knowing Naruto, he and the rest of the team would be leaving Wave Country soon and heading back to Konoha. In fact, he was surprised they'd stayed as long as they had. Wanting to avoid running into them on their way back, Kakashi had stayed along the borders of the country until nightfall and then found, to his surprise, that they had decided to spend the night. However, Naruto was the practical type and Kakashi fully expected the boy to try and go back to Konoha as soon as possible. But of course now, the Hokage's missive changed things and Kakashi felt himself growing worried. He wondered if it was just his nerves as team leader and being unable to actually do anything. Regardless, if Naruto and the others didn't start going back home soon, or if they started acting strangely on the way back, if things came to it, he'd make a new decision then. Kakashi supposed that if he found himself cornered, he could find a way to get Shirakumo alone and have a talk with the other Jonin. But for now, as promised, he would keep watching. Jiraiya POV. It was only after the Okami threatened to have a restraining order placed on him that, with great reluctance, Jiraiya the legendary Sannin, the great Toad Sage and best-selling author of the hugely popular Icha Icha series, removed himself from its premises. It wasn't that he was afraid of the local police, not by a long shot. But if his dashing mug were to be plastered on posters all around the nation's bathhouses, his research would sadly come to a screeching halt, and then what would he say to his adoring fans? Hitting the road again, Jiraiya tactfully thought to make himself scarce from that area for a few months and mulling over his well-worn map, decided to head north to Snow Country. He'd heard that the women there had the most beautiful pearly white skin and that the hot springs there were medicinal. And indeed, Jiraiya thought that he deserved some time spent healing with the heartache he now nursed at the thought of his self-imposed banishment from his own country. Instead of heading directly by a land route, which would lead him on a cumbersome path straight through the borders of several nations, Jiraiya decided to board a ship, as a sea route would both be faster and make for a nice change in pace. In fact, for the next installment of Icha Icha, he had been thinking of having his main character engage in a whirlwind romance at sea with the beautiful maiden daughter of a ship's captain, which would of course have to end tragically so that he could write a sequel. The journey was cut short, however, as it seemed that, despite the thick fog surrounding the land of waves, most ships stopped at its main port city to refuel, as well as to load and unload goods. Hearing from the captain, who, to Jiraiya's great disappointment, had never married nor fathered any daughters, that the ship would be docked for several hours, he went ashore with the intention of stretching his land legs. And for the first time in many years, he found himself speechless with shock. Jiraiya had been walking past a row of disheveled buildings near the port center when he saw what looked like a small child crawling on the ground. His lower body was covered by a black rubber tarp, and it was only after Jiraiya gave the boy a second glance that he realized that the boy didn't have any legs. The child's face was bony and drawn, and the only signs of life were his hands, which relentlessly slapped down on the ground before him and pushed his body up just a few inches at a time. "Where are you going, child?" Jiraiya asked softly, kneeling beside him. However, the boy didn't seem to hear him. Instead, silently, he kept pushing himself forward. "If he makes it to the other side of the city by tonight, he'll get fed," said a young girl who'd been poking lethargically at the ground with a stick. Jiraiya paused. "Fed? By who?" "People who think it's funny," said the girl with a shrug. Something hard clenched in Jiraiya's stomach and he got up. He looked around and, as if seeing for the first time, finally noticed the hard gazes of the passing people and the listless children gathered at every corner. Jiraiya had heard the rumors, of course, about how a man named Gato had managed to get his claws on a small island nation and sucked the very life out of its people. At the time, he'd merely thought that it wasn't any of his business and had passed it over. But hearing was not the same as seeing, and the mild discomfort he had felt then now turned into full-blown sorrow. It had been a long time since he had seen people brought down to such low levels. It had been bad in Konoha for a while following the Nine Tails attack, but nowhere near what he saw here. No, the last time Jiraiya had seen such a bleak setting had been during the Second Shinobi World War, when orphans on war-torn battlefields had been like particles of sand on a beach. When he returned to the dock, his mind was a storm of roiling thoughts, but one made itself the clear winner. "We're leaving in 10 minutes, you'd better return to your cabin," said the captain, leaning over the railing of the ship. Jiraiya rummaged in his pocket and finding a coin, he flipped it up to the man, who caught it with an adept grab. "I'll be staying here for just a bit longer," he called up to him. "You can keep the change." Waving his hand, letting the captain's farewell wash over him, "Hold on, hey, come back here. This isn't the full fare." Jiraiya began to head for the nearest bar, where he would hopefully be able to pry from the loose lips of a drunken sailor the full story of the country's current sorry state of affairs. Naruto, POV. The sun was low in the sky when they reached the dock. The fog for once was gone, leaving behind a gradient of purple to orange that then dissolved into murky water. There were only 2 boats there. One was a battered-looking fishing boat that had likely seen much better days. The other was a cargo ship, with black steam belching obnoxiously from a smokestack. It was on this ship that they'd be getting on. Before boarding, Naruto and the others exchanged farewells with their benefactor. "I appreciated your escorting me here," Kane said with a gracious smile, dabbing at something in her eyes with her sleeve. "I'll never forget you all. And I hope you won't forget me, either." "Oh, we will," Sai promised pleasantly. Mayu smiled tremulously. "Goodbye, Kane-san. You have to be brave, Mayu," said Rai, putting a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I know. Well, let's get going then," said Naruto a tad impatiently. With a final wave, Naruto and the others boarded the ship, which they found themselves fortunate to have caught. It would have been tough to find one leaving Wave Country on such short notice, but with Kane backing them, money had exchanged hands, and the ship's captain had agreed to make a short detour back to Fire Country. "You kids are ninja?" The captain, a gruff-looking man with a thick black mustache, eyed their pt.8 suspiciously. "Awfully young, aren't you?" "Actually, our growth's got stunted by our training. We're probably around your age. Assuming you're 60 or so." The captain couldn't have been a day over 50, but with his usual placid smile, Sai displayed his remarkable aptitude for lying through his teeth. Naruto privately thought to himself that the boy could probably do quite well for himself in the Chunin betting games. "We appreciate you going out of your way to take us back to our country," said Mayu earnestly. Leaning over the side of his ship, the captain spat out a wad of something black and slimy into the ocean, giving Naruto an unwelcome inkling of what the murk in the water could be. "Before that though, we'll be making a pit stop at a port town farther up north." "That'll be just fine," said Naruto. "Now, if you'll excuse us. We'll be resting in our cabin. We're tired and we have our own food, so unless the ship catches on fire or something, you don't have to bother with us," Rai added helpfully. "Your own food, eh? Well, I'm not complaining," said the captain. Then with a grunt of dismissal, he turned around to shout something at a passing crew member. Naruto and the rest of his team slipped into their cabin, where for about an hour, they rested on rotting bunk beds that creaked with every slosh of a wave against the ship's hull. When they felt the ship still and footsteps increased in volume around them, they each removed their pt.8 and pulled on a nondescript cloak. Making sure that their faces were hidden below the hoods, they crept out onto the boat's deck one by one, being careful to mingle with the small crowd of people who were getting off the ship. It had grown dark and damp, and their cloaked figures did not stand out from the others, who were similarly dressed. Just as Naruto stepped foot on the gangplank, however. "Hey, you lot," a crew member hollered down at them, and they froze, wondering if they'd been caught. "Yes?" Mayu asked, shuffling around. The man, or rather, boy, looked down at them imperiously through beady eyes, and in that split second, Naruto began to reach for the kunai strapped to his thigh. But then, the boy's expression caved in, and leaning forward, he lowered his voice. "It's my turn to peel the potatoes so I can't go on land, but get me something I can chew on for a bit, I'm feeling queasy. Here. I'll even give you a coin for it." He flipped something toward them that glinted under the dim dock lights as it spun, and with a practiced hand, Rai grabbed it smoothly out of the air. "Of course," Rai answered, looking down at the coin, and then back up at the boy with a predator-like smile. "I owe you," said the boy gratefully with a queasy smile. However, as soon as the boy had disappeared from sight, Rai pocketed the coin with a whistle. "Rai!" Mayu hissed. "What?" Rai said defensively. He had to learn his lesson sooner or later. As they exchanged small talk, the four casually separated from the rest of the group, and once Mayu had indicated that the coast was clear, they slipped down the wall to the river that spanned the town. The darkness of the night and the shadows of the overhanging bridges and walls hid them. Directing their chakra to their feet, they began to run across the water's surface as silently as they could. Only when they had left behind the last building of the port city did Naruto allow himself to even slightly relax. "Think that was good enough?" Rai muttered. Naruto glanced around, straining to extend his senses as far as he could. They were now in marshland, and with the moon almost completely blocked out by clouds that evening, even their trained eyes found it hard to make out anything in the horizon. The most obvious presences are gone now. "But to be sure, I'll keep the clones around for as long as I can," he said quietly. It had been Kane's idea. While they hadn't exactly announced themselves to Wave Country, Naruto and his team hadn't bothered to hide their presence or their identities. That was the point of their pt.8 after all, to identify them as ninja of their villages. Anyone who dared to trifle with someone wearing the leaf pt.8 would be responded to in kind by the full might of Konoha, and Konoha was one of the most powerful hidden villages. However, Kane had suggested that Naruto and his team should pretend to leave Wave Country so that her and Tezuna's enemies would relax their guard and underestimate them. Shirakumo had liked the plan, agreeing that 8 leaf nin gathered in one place was too obvious of a confrontation and would likely provoke unwanted attention. Giving Shirakumo his due respect as the most senior ninja in the vicinity, Naruto had bowed to his suggestion. His shadow clones, disguised as each member of his team, were still in the ship's cabin, while he and his real team were to return under cover of darkness to Tezuna's town. They would have to lie low for a while of course, but the gnawing sense that he was being constantly watched had disappeared, and Naruto suspected their plan had went off without a hitch. As Naruto continued to run in the deep darkness, his thoughts turned to the clones he'd left behind on the ship. He'd told the others, mostly for size sake, that he would dismiss them as soon as the ship reached Fire Country, but it had been partially a lie. Everything about the Hokage's missive had seemed fishy to him, and it hadn't been the fish stew. Why had the messenger given the message to Menma instead of Shirakumo, for whom it had been intended? Normally, messengers were under strict orders to deliver their message to a specific recipient and, depending on the importance of the message, had to go through several stringent procedures to verify the recipient's identity. And even if the message really had been from the Hokage, why were they being told to stay in Wave Country, effectively interfering with the affairs of another nation? At least another dozen questions raged inside his mind, but Naruto suppressed them. One of his clones had left the ship with them at the pit stop and would make his way back to Konoha. Once there, he'd be able to get a direct explanation from the Hokage about what was going on. Until then, he would obey the Hokage's mandate. And while he didn't like it, he would go along with Kane's fantasies of freedom and Mayu's illusions of playing hero. At the moment, Naruto couldn't see his teammates, but he could sense them running beside him, and he felt something hard clench in his stomach. It was dangerous out here in Wave Country. And he'd do whatever it took to protect his team. Whatever it took. But suddenly, his eyes widened and Naruto came to a screeching stop, as with zero warning, almost as if slamming headfirst into an invisible wall, he felt a horrifyingly familiar aura of cold bloodlust surge up out of seemingly nowhere. A cry of alarm rising belatedly to his lips, he immediately fell into a defensive stance. Hearing Rai swear beside him, he felt the others do the same. Well, what do we have here?" The gloating man's voice rung out from the darkness several meters in front of them. "New heathens to offer up for divine judgment, that's what. Shut up and do your job, newbie. Stop calling me a newbie." End of chapter 20. Chapter 21. Earth-shaking matter. "You must be Nine Tails. What do you want?" came the rumbling reply. "Lend me your chakra," said Naruto. "Otherwise, we'll both die." The claws that had been futilely swiping at Naruto from between the bars froze in mid-air, and then without any warning, the being behind the gates burst into a deep and rasping laugh that, as it resounded across the brackish water, raised the hairs on the back of his neck. "True, if you get killed here, that'd be inconvenient for me. You've got guts, if anything. Very well then. Here is a gift for coming this far." "Man, I'm sick and tired of this stupid patrol duty," said the man, making a spitting sound. Naruto felt his eyes narrow. The roiling bloodlust he was exuding was even stronger than Naruto could remember it being just 2 years ago in Yugakure. It could have felt that way due to the sheer vastness and emptiness of their surroundings, but nevertheless, if it had been a single storm cloud before, it was now a tempest. "You think I want to be here wasting my time?" replied another man's gravelly voice. Who are you? Name. Name your purpose. Naruto heard Mayu speak up bravely beside him, and he realized she must not have recognized the man. We're not supposed to let ninja in this area, said the man he had identified as Hidan, ignoring the first part of her question. So we're going to kill you. Or actually, Kakazu, how about you stay out of this and let me have some fun? Naruto slowly began to reach for the tanto strapped to his back, thankful for the darkness. It seemed that Hidan had not recognized them either. But what could he mean by not supposed to? And who was the other ninja? Hidan had called him Kakazu, with him? From the sounds of their voices, I doubt any of them would even fetch a price at the bounty office, grunted Kakazu, sounding wholly dissatisfied. Rai let out a nervous laugh. Whoa, ease up man. Let's not be too hasty. Don't you know who we are? Huh? The boss told us to rendezvous with you guys here, Rai continued, his voice remarkably smooth. Well, he did mean you guys, right? This seemed to give Hidan actual pause, for a split second, as if a dog had just caught the scent of something other than its prey, the thick bloodlust wavered. And in that same instant, Naruto formed the clone seal. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, shadow clone technique. Accompanied by the sounds of exploding smoke, 10 physical copies of Naruto solidified into existence, each one bearing a readied tanto in hand. Go, he said, and his clones burst forward in the direction where he sensed Hidan and Kakazu. In response, as they'd practiced, he heard the high-pitched warbling of blue birds as they freed themselves from Mayu's hair and the telltale rustling of paper as Sai drew out his scrolls. 4 o'clock, Rai. Mayu cried out, and from Rai's direction came the sound of hissing, and then the whistling sound of deadly metal flying through air, followed up by a string of explosions. Slightly averting his eyes from the brief orange glows of the blasts, Naruto saw on the floor ink black snakes wriggling straight into the resultant smoke. In theory, it was a simple tactic. Using his clones to first surround and herd the enemy, Mayu would use her blue birds to confuse them, and in the case where they didn't have any visual information on their targets, to gain intel on their whereabouts. Rai would follow up with exploding tags to further confuse them, and in the resultant disorder, Sai would bind them with his ink snakes. Then, in theory, Naruto and Rai could go in and finish off whoever was left. He blinked, processing the newly gained memory of one of his clones who had just been destroyed. In the fleeting glimpse the clone had gotten from the light of the exploding tags, neither Hidan nor the other man seemed particularly perturbed by the commotion they had just set off. However, Naruto had never expected it to. Now, Naruto said. As the others disappeared using the shunshin, he dashed toward the cloud of smoke, with his tanto raised in his hand. In the passing split seconds as he approached its center, his remaining clones began to leap out of the smoke, their tanto at the ready. Naruto's brow furrowed as he urged a current of lightning chakra, now almost as second nature to him as his wind chakra had been, to run through his body, and then simultaneously, he and his clones thrust their tanto into the boggy ground below. Blue and pure white sparks lit up the watery surface, as with a crackling sound, the earth broke into pieces, consuming anything still remaining on its surface. Naruto's clones exploded in sequential clouds of smoke, but Naruto himself had long since flashed away. The night clouds had momentarily drawn back, allowing through a few stray rays of moonlight to light his way. Touching back down and running as fast as he could in the direction they'd been headed, Naruto soon caught up to the rest of his team. With chakra powering their feet, they were running in spearhead formation with Mayu at its head. How much of a lead do we have? Rai hissed as Naruto quietly drew beside him. Naruto drew another tanto from his back. Not much, he said shortly. The moon's back out, and it'll be hard to lose them in open space. Where are we headed? My birds tell me there's a forest about 3 kilometers ahead of here, said Mayu, casting an anxious eye back. Lifting his head, Naruto looked straight forward, but even with some of his vision restored, most of the horizon was still a haze of dark outlines and blackness. But why are they even chasing us? I'm not sure, Naruto admitted. Hidan hadn't seemed to have recognized them even after their exchange, so it couldn't be some twisted form of vengeance. And it didn't seem to be out of malicious boredom either. He and his partner had some sort of ulterior motive in mind. Maybe they've given up, said Rai in a hopeful tone. But even before he'd finished talking, all 4 of them stiffened as a voice howled from behind them. And where the hell do you think you're going? They fell silent, straining their ears as if they would be able to hear the approaching footsteps of their pursuers. The wind was blowing in their faces, and Naruto thought grimly of how it must be carrying their scents back. We'll be killed if we only run like this, said Sai matter-of-factly, sounding as serious as Naruto had ever heard him. And killed if we fight them head-on, Rai muttered. We need another diversion, a better one. Until we can reach the forest. I can try staving them off with my birds," said Mayu. "No," said Rai immediately in a brusque voice. "They'd break you as soon as they were upon you. Mayu, that's the guy who took on Kakashi-sensei back in Yugakura and survived. And this time, he's got a buddy with him." Mayu's control over her blue birds worked best when she was physically near them. While they could instantaneously process information over a distance of up to 5 kilometers, actually channeling her genjutsu through them was only possible when she was within a radius of 100 feet of them. The others had all turned to Naruto for his orders. As his thoughts raced over their options, he felt his pulse rate begin to pick up. If they continued to simply flee toward the forest, Hidan and Kakazu would catch up before then. But at the same time, Naruto couldn't ask any one of them to stay behind in order to distract the two to make time for the others. That would essentially be condemning them to death. But what other choices were left to him then? Should they try fighting head-on with Hidan and his partner, despite not knowing the extent of their combative abilities? Naruto glanced at Mayu and Rai's pale but determined faces and felt his throat go dry. "Well, Naruto?" Rai prompted him. "This is what we're going to do," he said at last. Jiraiya POV. The Wet Dog was one of the better-known taverns along the pier, with the best sake found anywhere along the coastline, or so the drunk sailor that Jiraiya had interrogated claimed, anyways. And so, he found himself sitting down behind the countertop, swirling warmed sake around in a cup, while keeping an eye out in the crowd for anyone who looked like they could be by themselves. Soon enough, with a scraping sound, a flushed-looking man dressed in the telltale and rather threadbare cotton coat of a fisherman settled into the wooden chair beside him. Flagging the barman down with a finger, the man let out a loud hiccup. His unfocused eyes traveled across the bottles and flasks of sake behind the counter before moving on to his neighbors. When Jiraiya felt the drunk man's eyes on him, he looked down at his cup before taking a sip from it. "You a foreigner?" the fisherman slurred, leaning his face haphazardly against his hand. Where from?" "Fire, hick, country, by the looks of it." Jiraiya made a non-committal sound and put his cup down on the countertop. "How about you?" "Born and raised in Wave," the fisherman hiccuped. "You fish for a living?" "Among other things." The barman had brought him a small plate of fried seaweed and octopus, and he began to chew at it, making an audible crunching sound even over the din of the tavern. "Other things?" Jiraiya repeated. "Crunch, can't survive, hick, here no more doing just one thing." "Economy not doing well?" "Yeah, this place is gone to the dogs." "Crunch. Market might as well be non-existent." "Lucky to get 100 ryo for an entire shipment of fish, even." Jiraiya let out a whistle. "For an entire shipment? Sounds rough. Tell me about it," the fisherman let out a grunt, bobbing his head. "If I had anywhere else to go, hick, I certainly wouldn't still be here." Jiraiya traced the rim of his cup with a finger. "Still, you sound like you're doing rather well for yourself." "Well, I pay my dues, yay. That's the secret to survival around here. If you know what I mean." As drunk as he was, the fisherman had lowered his voice with a furtive look around, but the barman was serving another customer at the other end of the counter. "Huh," said Jiraiya, injecting as much admiration as he could into the single syllable. "The thing is, hick, everyone knows the daimyo ain't in control no more, yeah? It's the gangs who run the place now. It's all about staying on their good side." The fisherman broke off to noisily pop another octopus leg into his mouth, and as Jiraiya waited for him to continue, he watched as it was crushed into bits between the man's yellowed teeth. "You don't get in their way, crunch, and you give 'em what they want. And they'll leave you alone long enough to scrape enough ryo together to buy a night's stay in bed and some sake for your belly." The man broke into a raucous laugh and patted his stomach. Jiraiya followed with a rumbling laugh, holding his sake cup to the other man's face. "You seem like a sensible sort of man. Say, you wouldn't happen to know, would you, if I wished to invite some fairer company into my bed without fearing for my neck around here?" The fisherman immediately placed a knowing hand on Jiraiya's shoulder, having recognized a brother in need. "You need speak no further, my good man. You'll be glad to know that with just one word, you'll be guaranteed a restful night anywhere around here." "Oh? And what's that?" The man grinned, his teeth gleaming in the sickly light. "Akatsuki." Immediately, Jiraiya had to stop himself from reacting to the name, giving the fisherman only a small nod of acknowledgement. With forcibly stilled hands, he raised the sake cup to his mouth, draining the rest of it. Akatsuki? The criminal organization that Jiraiya had devoted so many years of his life to researching. The organization that Orochimaru had joined after defecting from Konoha. Could they truly be operating here, in Wave Country? Whatever the case, one thing was certain. His decision to stay behind in Wave Country had been the right thing to do. Something big involving Akatsuki was about to go down, and there was a good chance it had everything to do with the current fiasco with Gato. Jiraiya hadn't been sure what he would do after discerning the cause behind the country's ruination. There was a limit to even what he could do. But now that he knew the Akatsuki had a hand in this place, he knew he had to do something, even if that something only involved further intelligence gathering. That was what he had been doing all these years, after all, even going so far as to let down the Third's hopes of him taking up the mantle of Hokage. But inasmuch as it had been his determination to retrieve Orochimaru, it had also been for his home, Konoha. Because no matter how many years it had been since he'd actually been there, when it came down to it, Jiraiya would never let down Konoha, even at the cost of his life. Naruto, POV. Are you sure about this, Naruto? Mayu asked uneasily as she took off her cloak. You do know that if they don't fall for it, we'll be sitting ducks. I know. Naruto took off his cloak and immediately, he felt goosebumps rising on his arms as the harsh wind bit into them. To be fair, that Hidan guy doesn't seem to be the brightest bulb in the box, said Rai, his own cloak already tucked under his arm. His partner gave me some bad vibes though. What was his name again? Kakazu? Kakazu, Sai answered, and the others turned to him. He's an S-rank missing nin from Takagakure. How do you know that? Rai asked, looking rather taken aback. He's been listed in the bingo book for quite some time now. Rai opened his mouth to question him further. As it were mostly Jonin and Anbu who held bingo books. But Naruto held up a hand. Enough. Later. Focus on the mission at hand now. Are you all ready? He looked at each of his teammates in turn, and with focus refilling their expressions, they nodded. With a nod back, he brought his hands together in the clone seal. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. With puffs of identical clouds of smoke, a dozen Narutos fell into place on the ground beside them, matching their punishing pace. Naruto, the real one, flung his cloak at the pair nearest him, and one immediately tugged the hood over himself. At the same time, Mayu and the others also threw their cloaks at a pair of clones until there were 4 clones wearing each of their cloaks. With every cloaked clone paired with one without, all 12 of his clones shot off into slightly different directions. But headed ultimately for the forest. See you too soon, Rai muttered, before turning sharply on his heel and heading east away from the forest. Sai, with a reluctant glance back at Naruto, quickly followed suit. Stay safe, Mayu whispered back, her voice shaking like a leaf in the wind. Naruto heard her step into place beside him as they ran in the opposite direction, west. The forest was large, even though they weren't headed directly for it, the black mass of trees grew rapidly bigger and bigger as they closed the distance. Without their cloaks, the chilly night wind struck harshly into their faces as they raced along the marsh, the cold bog water seeping into their sandals. Naruto looked back, but there appeared to be nothing there beside the long stretch of marshland they had just crossed. The bloodlust too had faded, leaving behind just a beating of his heart in his chest and the shallow breathing of Mayu running next to him. Have your birds found them? He asked Mayu, who brought her hands together to make the bird seal. They can't get near without being detected, but it looks like Hidan is headed straight for the forest, she said, her voice tinged with relief. And Kakazu? None of them see him. All right. Keep the bird on Hidan, but make sure it's not detected and keep the other birds searching for Kakazu. Have Rai and Sai reached the end of the forest yet? They've just reached the other end, Mayu confirmed. They'll be out of range soon. Good, keep your birds with them for as long as you. Naruto broke off and his eyes widened. Without even enough time to shout, he raised up his tanto to protect himself. With a grunt, Naruto had just barely managed to raise it in time before a powerful kick slammed into the flat side of his blade, sending him flying backward. Still struggling to hold his tanto in front of him, Naruto dug the heels of his sandals into the ground and felt the wet earth wedging alongside his soles from the sheer force behind the kick. Finally, he came to a stop, his legs covered with cold slabs of mud. What happened? He heard Mayu gasp. The dark figure that had attacked him out of seemingly nowhere hadn't followed him, choosing instead to cross his arms and regard Naruto with an almost leisurely interest. You're quite fast on your feet, said a deep voice. It was the one who had been with Hidan, the one named Kakazu. It was still too dark to make out his features. All Naruto could make out in the dim light was a dark, bulky outline. How did you find us so quickly? Naruto asked, his heart pounding in his ears. I commend you for thinking of using the wind in your favor as quickly as you did. I'll admit, I was fooled at first, thinking the 4 of you had split and headed separately for the forest. In fact, I'm pretty sure my idiot of a partner is even now still headed for the forest. But unfortunately for you too. I'm not him. With that, Kakazu suddenly shot forward, heading straight toward them, but this time, Naruto was ready. He held his hand out before him, urging his chakra together. Rapidly, streams of blue light began to encircle his palm, swirling faster and faster until it had formed a tight ball. Digging his heels into the earth, Naruto sent lightning chakra into his feet, igniting his nerves, and with an explosive sound, he too kicked off, raising his hand into the air to meet Kakazu. Jiraiya POV. So you're a ninja, big guy? The girl he had fondly nicknamed Grapefruit Breasts slapped lightly at his knee, rubbing her namesake against his arms. She was dressed in a Chinese-style kipao dress that was slit dangerously high up along her thigh. Gwahahaha. I'm not just a ninja, Jiraiya let out a loud laugh, his face flushed red with sake. I'm one of the legendary Sannin, they call me Jiraiya the Great Toad Sage. Wow, a Sannin, gushed the identically dressed blonde girl on his other side, who he'd tenderly nicknamed Bubble Butt. She paused, tapping a manicured nail against her plump lips. What's that again, Fukumi? Gosh Fukuyu, don't you know? It's like, you know, that communist guy. Stalin? Said Bubble Butt dubiously. Jiraiya had no idea what they were talking about. Women, he thought affectionately. Following the advice of the fisherman he'd met at the Wet Dog, Jiraiya had soon managed to find himself in the shadowy region of the harbor city, where he'd been welcomed with open arms into the private room of a slightly more trashed bar. Guzzling down fried squid and vats of sake with a beautiful woman on each arm, Jiraiya was having a hard time remembering what he'd been so serious about just hours ago. So what are you here in Wave Country for? Grapefruit Breasts had returned her attention to Jiraiya and was now lazily stroking his chest with her long nails. What else but to meet you ladies? Jiraiya said as smoothly as possible, an effect that was slightly ruined by his missing his mouth with his cup, spilling some sake on his shoulder instead. Oh, you're so silly. Bubble Butt giggled. Let me guess, you're on some super top secret ninja mission, aren't you? I can't say, Jiraiya said regretfully, closing his eyes in sorrow. If I did tell you, I'd have to kill you. And if you two ladies were gone from this world, what meaning would be left to living? The two women burst into high-pitched giggling, clutching at his arms. You can tell us. None of us will remember in the morning, anyways, Grapefruit Breasts said in a sing-song voice, this time rubbing her breasts along the nape of Jiraiya's neck. Not after what we plan on doing with you, anyways. Bubble Butt breathed into his ear, her breath coming out hotly against his skin. At her words, Jiraiya's eyes widened and he fell into a fit of coughing. When he'd finally regained his breath, he wheezed, so, where were we? But first, what's the magic word? Grapefruit Breasts jumped up on his back playfully and wrapped her arms around his neck. The magic word? He blinked. Bubble Butt wrapped her arms around his arm possessively. You know. The word you have to say to get anywhere here. Wahaha. Oh, that one? He said, thinking back to the fisherman with bad teeth. Grapefruit Breasts' cold fingers caressed his face. Yes, that one. Akatsuki wasn't it? Jiraiya said lightly. Wrong, Bubble Butt hissed. Jiraiya's eyes widened, but before he could do anything, Grapefruit Breast's weak grip on his head immediately turned iron strong, and she twisted her hands, snapping his neck. At the same time, with a flash of gleaming steel, Bubble Butt's hand slashed across the front of his exposed neck. Warm blood spurted out, dotting her expressionless face with red. The two women let go of the Sannin and backed away. With a thud, the body dropped to the floor of the room. The white hair fanning around it added a sense of finality to their deed. See? Said the blonde, looking down at the body with a slight sneer on her face. There was nothing to be nervous about. Her partner poked the body with the heel of her pumps. Zabuza-sama said he'd be strong, though. Give a ninja a woman and some sake, and he's only a man, the blonde said sagely. I guess so. Are you sure he was a Sannin? That would be is not was said a voice from behind them. Stiffening in shock, the blonde let out a cry of alarm, but before she could do anything else, something long and white had wrapped itself around both of the girls' bodies, immobilizing them. Squirming fruitlessly to free themselves, they saw before them the ninja they had just killed regarding them with a grave look on his face. But how? Cried out the blonde. She looked down at the ground just in time to see the dead Sannin, and the puddle of blood explode into a cloud of smoke, leaving nothing behind. Her heart pounding painfully against her ample chest, she slowly raised her eyes to meet the other ninjas, and what she saw there made her tremble. Now ladies, said Jiraiya. Where were we? Naruto, POV. Missing Kakazu by what felt like the width of a hair, Naruto's Rasengan slammed into the earth, sending out a great wave of mud. Before Naruto could move out of the way, his face crumpled in pain as he felt a crushing force slam into his ribs, sending him flying backwards. Then even before he'd landed, Kakazu was right in front of him again, moving as fast as he could. Naruto ducked low below his leg and kicked out sideways in a leg sweep, but dodging that, Kakazu jumped high into the air. Grimacing in pain, Naruto propelled himself after him with another crackle of lightning chakra, flashing into the air just above Kakazu. With his teeth gritted, he concentrated on the ball of blue chakra materializing in his hand, determined to take advantage of his aerial position. The moonlight was just behind him, and in that instant Naruto could finally make out what Kakazu looked like. Dressed in a large black cloak that was fluttering in the wind, the man's face was mostly covered, but Naruto could see a pair of green pupil-less eyes staring straight back at him. They widened as Naruto's hand plunged straight for the man's heart. But in a smooth motion that seemed almost impossibly fast, Kakazu's arm struck out at Naruto's hand, driving it outward so that it missed him, and with another turning kick that connected on his shoulder, sent him crashing down into the ground. With another grimace, Naruto managed to twist on his hands to lessen the impact, which still sent out even more waves of mud in every direction, separating him from Kakazu. As they waited for the mud to settle, Naruto hastened to clamber to his feet. Seeing tiny stars circling around him, he swayed and then almost jumped, as suddenly, a raucous sound, was that squawking? Filled the air. Naruto, he heard Mayu call out urgently. He turned and saw not only Kakazu bearing down on him, but further back, what looked like a dense dark cloud descending upon them. Immediately understanding her intention, he struggled to gather himself together and then flashed away, dodging just in time Kakazu's leg. Landing a safe distance away, Naruto saw the flock of shrieking birds set instead on Kakazu, screeching and nipping at the ninja. Impatiently, the man batted at the bird, ripping it in two, but instantly, the parts recombined back into a whole bird once more. This time, Kakazu kicked out widely, destroying almost half the flock, but again, the birds reformed and continued to peck at him. Lowering his leg, Kakazu made a sking sound of impatience, seemingly deciding to ignore the birds for now. He instead returned his gaze back to Naruto. "I didn't realize," Kakazu growled, sounding as if he were talking to himself. Whereas he had only regarded Naruto with passing interest before, his concentration was now wholly on him. For some reason, his eyes seemed especially fixated on Naruto's hair. "What is your purpose for attacking us here?" Naruto called out, with a pant. Kakazu took a step toward him, and his eyes narrowing, Naruto lowered himself into a defensive stance before continuing. "You're an intelligent one, aren't you?" said Kakazu, not sounding even the slightest bit winded. "At least, more so than the last Jinchuriki we captured." Naruto froze. As if an eraser had wiped across the chalkboard of his mind, everything went blank. From a distance, he heard Mayu speak up, her voice tight with anxiety. "Captured? What do you mean?" Kakazu opened his mouth as if to answer, and then suddenly, he stumbled. A look of fleeting surprise flashed across his face. "What's this?" Kakazu held a hand up to his head, as if holding himself steady. The shadow of a bird's wing flashed across his face, and as he looked around at the birds, understanding filled his expression. "Ah. The birds. My birds have poison on their beaks," Mayu said shakily. "And once a sufficient amount reaches your heart, it'll stiffen the heart muscle until it becomes so hard, it completely stops pumping blood, rendering it useless." "I see," said Kakazu. His hand dropped to his side. He looked at Mayu, his strange eyes glinting. "How fortunate for me, then, that I have multiple." Before Mayu could react, Kakazu exploded forward. He ignored Naruto, and as if in slow motion, Naruto blankly watched Kakazu go straight past him. His eyes trailed from the moving ninja to, just ahead, the target, a pale, shaking form with whitened eyes. "Where have I seen this before?" The nostalgia of the scene, as if clubbing Naruto in the head, brought him back into his senses. "Mayu!" Naruto cried out. With a painful crackle, lightning chakra swept through his entire body, and he flung himself forward. Moving faster than he could ever remember moving before, Naruto got in front of Mayu, but before he could do anything else, Kakazu's kick connected with his chest, making a terrible crushing sound. The force behind it was powerful enough to send the two of them flying into the air before careening into the muddy ground. With the wind knocked right out of him and his ribs screaming at him, he was fairly certain they were at the very least fractured, if not broken. It was all Naruto could manage to land on his 2 feet. To his relief, he heard Mayu land on her feet as well. With Naruto having taken most of the impact, it seemed that she was unharmed. He felt something warm trickle down his chin, and when he raised a hand to wipe it off, it came away red. Calmly, Kakazu lowered his leg and looked straight at him. Panting, and with his teeth gritted, Naruto regarded the ninja. The way Kakazu seemed to always be one step ahead of him, and the way Naruto's attacks seemed to be a mere hindrance rather than an actual threat. It was almost like fighting Kakashi. But in this case, a Kakashi who did not care at all for his well-being. One thing was for sure, Kakazu was too strong for him. Naruto wiped away another trickle of blood from his mouth. What should I do? Clearly, fighting Kakazu one-on-one the way he was now would only get both him and Mayu killed. Even fighting two-on-one was also out of the question. Mayu was a long-range support ninja, and one of her most offensive weapons, the flock of blue birds, seemed to have no real effect on Kakazu. Their escape strategy had failed them, and their attempts at reasoning or bargaining with the man had gone nowhere. Worst of all, Kakazu had talked about Jinchuriki as if he'd fought with one personally before, and as if he knew about what Naruto was. However, that didn't matter at the moment. What mattered was that Naruto was going to be dead very soon if he couldn't figure out how to take on Kakazu. But how? Kakazu was stronger and faster than him. Naruto couldn't keep using his lightning chakra forever to dodge him, and he'd yet to even show his hand at jutsu. Kakazu was completely out of his league. So how could Naruto defeat him? What did he have that Kakazu didn't have? That Kakashi didn't have? Naruto felt a cold bead of sweat drip down his temple. He recalled in his mind the words of a year ago, the words of a monster. You've got guts, if anything. Very well then. Here is a gift for coming this far. His hands balled into fists by his side. He'd told himself that he was merely putting off talking to the beast because he was so busy, but the truth was, he'd never wanted to use its power. But now, what other choice did he have left? Letting out a deep breath, Naruto forced himself to relax. Closing his eyes and clearing his mind of everything else, he prepared to set foot once more in the long watery corridors of what? He heard Kakazu suddenly spoke up, and his eyes flew back open. Kakazu had been silently regarding him, occasionally batting aside the birds that still continued to peck at him, but now, his head was tilted upward, as if talking to someone in the sky. After another long silence, Kakazu bowed his head. Very well, then. As you wish. Kakazu lowered his eyes to meet Naruto's shocked ones. I'll be back eventually. Prepare yourself. And then without another word, he disappeared. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22. Veritable pandemonium. The ship's departure from the dock had been stalled for some time for an unknown reason, but finally, when both the sky and the ocean had become a deep inky black, it set off again. The lights from the cabins cast a reflective yellow glow across the sea, making it an easy mark for Kakashi to follow. Keeping watch from below the stern of the ship, it hadn't taken him much effort to identify the cabin Naruto and the others were in. Naruto must have passed by an uncovered porthole, for Kakashi had immediately noticed the flash of red. It's not like you to let down your guard, Naruto, even if you're returning from a completed mission, Kakashi chided silently. As the hours passed, the wind picked up and the lights in the cabins began to flicker off. Kakashi himself was starting to feel it in his shoulders. I'm getting old, aren't I? He thought amusedly to himself, and he'd been drenched in icy sea water more than once from straying too close to the ship. Finally, only when Kakashi had narrowly avoided being vomited on by some poor straggler at the deck of the ship did he decide that it was time to actually get on board. Projecting a burst of chakra down to his legs, Kakashi shot himself up along the ship's side, landing silently in the shadowy silhouettes of a stack of wooden barrels. Looking around the empty deck, he made sure that the coast was clear. Though even if it weren't, he doubted he'd come across any real trouble. The ship had some hired guards, but they were at best Genin-level ninja who could barely tell apart clones from the real thing. No, the hardest part about this would be hiding his presence from Naruto and the others. However, Naruto's cabin was all the way at the other side of the ship, and it was unlikely that any of them would venture out before dawn, by which time they'd already be at the border of Fire Country. The best course of action, he decided, would be for him to simply sit tight where he was and then get off the ship before it docked at port. Suddenly, hearing footsteps, Kakashi shrunk further into the shadows, but it was just a stumbling, pale-faced cabin boy, simultaneously swearing and hacking up what looked like the rest of his dinner over the railing. Nevertheless, Kakashi kept his eyes sharp and watched the boy, with a final utterance of a curse word, stumble back down through a hatchway. Kakashi wrinkled his nose. Some of the vomit must have splashed onto the deck, for he could quite clearly smell, along with the distinct odor of stomach acid, that dinner must have involved quite a few potatoes. Jiraiya POV. What are you going to do to us? Grapefruit Breasts breathed in a high voice, her eyes flicking down repeatedly to the object he was twirling in his hand. "Surely you don't think we'll crack from you tickling us with a feather," Bubblebutt scoffed. She'd recovered face relatively quickly despite being completely immobilized in his hair trap, but the underlying tension was still apparent. "This will make excellent material for the next book I'm writing," said Jiraiya with a shake of the feather. "It'll take some time, but you ladies aren't particularly pressed for it, I hope. We're not telling you anything." Bubblebutt spat at Jiraiya, but he made no move to avoid or clean it off. He sighed instead. For her own sake, he hoped she would. Naruto, POV. They were waiting where they had agreed to meet, by a massive oak tree near the edges of a forest along the far outreaches of Tezuna's village. After everything they had already gone through, Naruto had braced himself for the worst, so when Rai and Sai's faces finally came into view, the relief he felt was so immense, he nearly stumbled on his landing. With Mayu helping to support him up, the two of them landed down just as the sun was starting to rise, spreading its tendrils almost shyly through the cracks of the canopy trees. "Mayu, Naruto," Rai called out to them, relief spreading across in his face. Leaving Sai behind, he began to run toward them. "You're Alri, whoa. Naruto?" Rai hesitantly came to a stop in front of them, his eyes raking up and down Naruto's bloodied form. "I'm fine, they're just flesh wounds," said Naruto, deciding not to mention the pain in his ribs. The pain had already ebbed away to a minor throbbing in his chest. Sitting down, he tipped his head back and allowed himself to lean back against a tree trunk. "Kakazu found us," Mayu said shakily, her arms crisscrossing across her chest. Rai's eyes widened. "You too? What do you mean?" Naruto frowned, quickly turning toward the other boy. "Were you caught too?" "Yeah, that other one. Hidan, he got to us," Rai confirmed with a troubled look on his face. Then, apparently noticing Mayu's expression, he hastened to add, "But nothing happened. He was just spewing a lot of crap. And then he suddenly started talking to the air before leaving. That's essentially what happened with us," said Mayu. Except Kakazu didn't talk so much." Rai's face noticeably grew in pallor, and this time, it was her turn to add, "Don't worry, I'm alright." It was Naruto who fended him off right until he suddenly left. As some of the color returned to his face, Rai let out a whistle. "Didn't Sai say he was an S rank? And you managed to hold him off?" Naruto didn't say anything, but clenched his hands tightly. He looked down at the ground, unable to meet his teammates' eyes. It had been his plan to split up the team and send off decoys, but it hadn't worked. His decisions had placed all of his teammates in danger, and it could only be called a miracle that they were all there alive. "Naruto." He heard Mayu start, but she was cut off as suddenly. Rai punched him on the shoulder so strongly, he could have sworn he'd heard another rib crack. Naruto's head snapped up to see Rai looking down at him exasperatedly. "Oh come on now, enough with the gloom," said Rai. "Two insanely powerful lunatics were after us, but the three, well, four I suppose, of us are all here in one piece, relatively unharmed. What more could you ask for?" Naruto paused. "Sorry," he finally said, his hands uncurling at his sides. Rai was right, this was no time to be wallowing in regret. And if it was any consolation, despite Kakazu's comment about Jinchuriki, Mayu seemed to be none the wiser. "Anyways," Rai said, waving away his apology with a dismissive air. "We did get something out of that Hidan guy. Turns out they weren't just a random pair of criminals walking around in the middle of nowhere. They're involved with whatever's going down in Wave Country right now." Mayu's hand leapt up to her open mouth. "You mean with Gato? There's going to be an event of some sort in 3 days," Sai finally spoke up. It seemed the incident with Hidan had gotten to him, he seemed unusually on edge. "Someone important will be in the city." Rai shrugged. "Well, that's the basic digest of what we thought Hidan was saying anyways. It's probably got nothing to do with us, but..." Naruto got to his feet. "But first things first, we need to get back. We'll decide what to do after we've gotten back in touch with Shirakumo and the others." However, forced to take multiple detours and roundabouts to throw off any possible trackers, it was several more hours before Naruto and the others finally reached Tezuna's home. Ushered through the door by a worried-looking Tsunami, the starving four were promptly seated at the table with platters stacked high with, as one could have guessed it, fish and rice. Once they had managed to get out the full story of what had happened, the involved adults stood around with troubled expressions on their faces while Naruto and his teammates stuffed their faces. "An event in the harbor city in which someone important will be in danger?" Tsunami murmured uneasily. "There's only one thing that could be," said Kane flatly. Tezuna sighed. "Aye. The ceremony." "The ceremony? What's that?" Menma cocked his head curiously. "You've got a piece of rice stuck on your face by the way," he pointed out to Rai, who ignored him. "The daimyo and his children will be paraded through the city in a charade of well-being, with the stated purpose of reassuring the citizens that they are doing just fine," Kane spat. But basically, one of Gato's ways of appeasing the other nations by telling them that he's not trying to overthrow the system. And at the same time, reminding everyone in the country who's really in control, Shirakumo murmured, his brow furrowed in thought. "So is the daimyo going to be assassinated then?" Tazuna asked in a heavy voice. "It depends on whether those two you described, Hidan and Kakazu, was it? Work for Gato or not," Kane said. "But regardless, this doesn't change anything. Risks like this have already been accounted for in my plans." Naruto put his chopsticks down and looked at Kane. "Plans?" The others had also stopped eating, though Rai continued to chew on some seaweed as they waited for the gorilla merchant to answer. She looked around at them seriously, her freckles in stark contrast with the morning lighting. "I've already forced you all to overextend your stay for the affairs of a country that have nothing to do with you," she said, with a slight bow of her head. "And I am truly sorry for that. But that ceremony in 3 days is when all my plans come to a head. After that ceremony is over, whether the mission has succeeded or failed, I will ensure with all my power that you are all properly compensated and relieved from your obligations here. And this mission will involve?" Shirakumo crossed his arms across his chest. Kane smiled grimly and looked directly at Naruto. "How good are you all at behaving like actual, normal children?" Jiraiya POV. Harumo whistled as he looked around at the messy scene. "This is brutal, Jiraiya-sama." His nose wrinkled. "Is that something burning I smell?" Harumo was one of his trusted sources in Wave Country, and their mutually beneficial relationship had a long history spanning the many years Jiraiya had spent building up his spy network. The short pony-tailed ninja's best characteristic was, in Jiraiya's opinion, the way he showed up promptly and without any unnecessary questions as soon as he was called for. He was, if anything, efficient and experienced in covering his tracks, making the chance of his being caught and spilling details of their alliance rather minuscule indeed. Jiraiya sighed heavily. If only they'd break sooner. He made no move to wipe his face, which was speckled with tiny flecks of dark blood. It would have been better for them. "I assume you got the information you wanted?" Some. The one who actually knew anything didn't break quite so easily. Squatting down, Harumo opened the mouth of one of the bodies, peering inside it with the air of looking at an interesting museum specimen. "You had preventative measures to stop her from biting her tongue or ingesting any sort of poison, I gather." "Yes," Jiraiya said simply. He chose not to mention how he'd chosen to end her life as soon as he realized that he'd gotten everything he'd ever get out of her. A loyal one, she'd been. She was working for Zabuza, who is in turn working for Gato. Harumo nodded in confirmation. "Yes, I've heard multiple reports about Zabuza being spotted as a bodyguard for Gato. He's not exactly a difficult man to miss. But is that it?" She didn't seem to understand the significance behind a certain word they were using as a code name for suspicious individuals such as myself. "But perhaps you could shed some light on their connection to them." "This certain word being?" Harumo said curiously. "Akatsuki, Akatsuki." Harumo repeated slowly, tasting the word with his tongue. His eyes had lit up like a child that had just caught sight of a favorite toy he had put aside at one point and then forgotten about its existence. "I'd heard rumors but dismissed them." "Rumors about?" Jiraiya prodded him. "About a growing organization that was supporting Gato from the shadows or even controlling, perhaps," Harumo said. Then with a thoughtful look, he added, "There's been a confirmed recent sighting of Kakazu at one of the bounty stations along the coastline." Jiraiya folded his arms across his chest, processing the information. Kakazu was one of the more frequently spotted members of Akatsuki, showing up from time to turn in a ridiculous amount of bounties in exchange for money. However, there was nothing Jiraiya could do about that. Bounty stations were strictly black market, and while information regarding Kakazu's visits could be bought at a price, his visits were indiscriminate and without pattern, making them impossible to track. Harumo got up, wiping his hands clean on the sides of his pants. "Was that it, Jiraiya-sama?" "There was one final thing I got out of the interrogation," Jiraiya said distractedly. "They were supposed to report back to Zabuza at some sort of big event soon, in the harbor city. Do you know anything about that?" "That'll be the daimyo's ceremony for sure," said Harumo without any hesitation. "Ceremony?" Naruto, POV. "Out of the way, kid." In the fat man's hurry to get to the front of the crowd, he reached out with an impatient hand to shove the small boy to the side, but to his surprise, it swiped uselessly through the air. The man glanced down and then did a double take, finding nothing there. He looked around, but there were at least a dozen other children of the same size and coloring in the immediate vicinity. The boy could have been any one of them. So, with little more than a fleeting wondering thought, the man moved on. Meanwhile, through bright blue eyes, Naruto watched the man disappear into the crowd before effortlessly merging into it once more. As he began to be jostled forward by the mass, he looked around at the numbers calculatingly. It seemed that a substantial number of people had gathered at the city for the ceremony, for he had never seen even half that number of people during the busiest hours of the city. And while most of them looked like civilians, there were some who stood out like a sore thumb, namely those with weapons. Most were subtle, with daggers strapped to their thighs, but here and there were the obvious ones with bulky swords and katana on their backs. Those kinds of people walked about with a bubble around them as the civilians avoided eye contact and gave them a wide berth. A flashing motion caught Naruto's eye, and he turned to see a scruffy-looking boy with dark coloring nod at him before ducking and disappearing into the crowd. As he looked around, several more caught his eye, a sour-faced girl with short hair, a scratched-up boy with cropped black hair. Sakura, Menma. He couldn't spot Mayu, Sai or Sasuke, but that was because they were situated on the other side of the venue, a winding path that led from the daimyo's ceremonial estate to the city's center. They were all arranged strategically near the front of the crowd, along with most of the other civilian children. It was a custom in Wave Country for the daimyo's procession to hand out ryo and candy to the watching children, and as Naruto looked around at the many orphans crowding around him, it was apparent that most of them had made the pilgrimage here for that very purpose. Is this why Kane-san took it as well as she did when she found out we were her escorts? Naruto wondered. Henja, the transformation jutsu, was an E-rank jutsu, but it was difficult to maintain perfectly while under high external strain. And the closer your transformation was to your real appearance, the easier it was to maintain it. For example, it would be easier for an adult male to transform into another adult male than into a young boy, and vice versa. Once Naruto and Sasuke's teams had transformed into typical hungry-eyed children, melting into the background became effortless. This was key for the mission Kane had proposed to them 3 days earlier in Tezuna's house. To rescue the daimyo's 2 children, the prince and princess, so that Gato couldn't use them as a means of controlling the daimyo anymore. According to Kane, rescuing the daimyo himself would be too risky. Not only would he be the most heavily guarded, but it would only give Gato a reason to seize the vacuum of authority left behind in the daimyo's absence, no matter how temporary. Suddenly, there was a flurry of motion and then hushed whispering. The moving crowd came to a stop, all of the heads facing one direction, and there, at the far end of the pathway, Naruto could see what looked like the beginnings of a procession making its way through. At the back was a series of ornately decorated sedan chairs, from which Naruto could make out smiling faces and waving hands the daimyo and his children. And standing around them was an array of women and men with kunai and swords, glinting nakedly on their persons. Naruto quickly did a head count and saw that Kane's information had been on spot. The sedan chair holding the princess and prince was relatively lightly guarded with 3 bodyguards, not including the carriers. If Kane's information could be further counted on, there were a few more guards scattered in the crowd disguised as civilians, but if their plan worked out, they shouldn't have time to matter. The daimyo's sedan chair, on the other hand, was surrounded by no less than 7 guards, most prominently of which was a pale-skinned man with bandages running across the lower half of his face and a gigantic broadsword on his back. Without fail, wherever he passed through the crowd, a visible wave of fear swept through it. "That's Zabuza," a passing voice hissed tightly in his ear, Menma, and Naruto nodded. So this was the infamous missing nin. He'd thought that Menma's team had finished him off, but this was no time to question things. Either Zabuza had survived or someone was impersonating him. Whatever the case, he was another powerful obstacle they would have to get through to complete the mission. Naruto felt an uneasy shiver go down his spine. It was strange, however, that a missing nin could be so boldly parading in front of thousands of people like that. No matter how powerful he was basically painting a target on himself for any of his village's hunter nin. As he waited for the signal, Naruto watched the procession get closer and closer to where he was standing. Every now and then, a hand, full of something that glinted brightly in the afternoon sun, popped out of one of the sedan chairs, and every time, as if a dam had broken, the children surged forward. There seemed to be some invisible rule in place that prevented adults from joining in. When a few stragglers moved forward to do so, they were promptly knocked out by the children around them. If they were lucky, their unconscious bodies were dragged out to the edge of the crowd. Just as the first sedan chair began to pass by where Naruto was waiting, the hand popped out once more, and this time, he could see that it was attached to a young-looking girl dressed richly in pale robes. She looked cheerful, likely she was too young to understand the precarious hostage situation her family and country was in. The children around Naruto surged forward, and he joined in half-heartedly. He reached up in the air with a hand, and in that instant, met the princess's gaze. Her eyes were blue, like his. Taken aback, he held his breath, and then with a bright smile, she tossed the coins in her hand toward him. Before they reached him, however, several of the larger and rougher orphans knocked his hand aside and leaped up to swipe the coins. Naruto saw another orphan boy aiming a kick at his chest, easily dodging it. He nevertheless pretended to have been hurt and fell backward in the crowd, intending to disappear and lose whatever the small attention he'd unintentionally gathered. But before Naruto hit the ground, a strong hand grabbed his shoulder and pulled him up. He looked up to see a tall man with long shaggy white hair and immediately recognized him as the man he'd chanced upon in the bathhouse a week ago. "Are you alright?" said the man, and Naruto mutely nodded, his mind whirring with several possibilities. Was this other man working for Gato? Had he found out about the plot and seen through Naruto's disguise? But before Naruto could do anything else, the man simply said, "Be more careful from now on," and then walked away. Naruto stood still, unsure of how to react, and as if answering him, a roaring sound filled his ears. Naruto's head snapped toward the procession's path just in time to see three massive black and white tigers leaping at Zabuza. The signal. The crowd had been stunned into silence, but as the missing nin pulled his sword off his back with an accompanying flash of steel, they were galvanized into action. Screaming, people, children and adults alike, began scrambling away from the path. The same orphan boy who had tried to kick Naruto before came running at him with a panicked expression on his face. Leaping forward, Naruto jumped past him, heading straight for the procession. Naruto landed on the path, with Rai, Sakura and Menma right behind him. All of the guards were distracted, focusing their attention on the other side of the path, where now, on top of size beast drawings, a flock of birds as well as several fast-moving bodies were wreaking havoc. Naruto pulled the tanto from his back and in the same smooth action, burst forward to the princess and prince's sedan chair. The main guard, a tall disciplined-looking woman with hair tightly pulled back in a bun, noticed him, and as she raised her blade toward him, her mouth opened to shout a warning. But before she could make a sound, Naruto was past her. With a spray of bright red blood, the body fell to the ground and her head rolled away on the ground. When Naruto glanced behind to check, he saw that Rai had similarly taken care of the other guard, while Menma and Sakura knocked out the third. Menma and Sakura looked at them with stunned expressions on their faces, but paying no mind, Naruto reached into the sedan chair. The prince and princess, looking terrified, had backed away to the other side. Noticing that their eyes were fixated on the blood dripping from his tanto, Naruto hastily returned it to its sheath. Then, he grabbed the arm of the princess. Rai grabbed the prince and pulled her trembling figure out. She began to struggle in his hands, but she was weak, even for a civilian. "What are you doing?" the princess cried out. "Stop. We're here to save you," said Naruto quietly. He shot a look toward the daimyo's sedan, though Zabuza's back was toward them. One of the guards had noticed them and had started to move toward them with a sword in his hand. "We don't have time. Come quietly, or I'll knock you out." Growing still, the princess's eyes became as round as the coins she'd been tossing out, and taking advantage of it, Naruto tossed her over his shoulder and jumped out of the chair. Just as he prepared to leap down into the crowd, there was a scream. "Rai!" Naruto turned to see Rai duck just in time to dodge a long sword. Rai backed away protectively in front of the prince as the guard thrust the sword again at him. Naruto's hand immediately went down to the kunai on his thigh holster, but before he could throw it, there was a flash of blue, and then the guard was yelping, swiping at the air around his face with his hands. "Mayu!" Rai yelled out, relieved. "I'm okay. Go help the others." Mayu, pale-faced, nodded. Menma tackled the guard she'd been distracting, and she ran off, her birds flocking around above her head. To Naruto's relief, Zabuza seemed to be completely ignoring them, focusing his attention instead on the Jonin weaving in and out to attack him, Shirakumo. Naruto and Rai jumped down into the crowd, the princess and prince collectively in their arms, and began to run swiftly past the shocked faces of the civilians. As they ran through the mayhem, one guard managed to get past Menma and Sakura, but Naruto quickly disposed of him with a flick of a kunai. After that, with a cursory look around, Naruto confirmed that there was no one else coming after them. "Send the signal," Naruto said shortly. Rai nodded and brought his hands together in the snake hand seal. Immediately, there was a distant exploding sound. On the other side of the gigantic crowd, a billowing black cloud of smoke rose into the air, a planted harmless letter bomb that signaled that Naruto and Rai had successfully retrieved the prince and princess and that the others should retreat. Be safe, everyone, Naruto thought to himself, his teeth gritted and his heart pounding loudly in his ears. Jiraiya POV. With a long history of battle with fate, Jiraiya had set foot in the harbor city that morning, steeling himself for whatever the day's events should throw at him. However, what was unfolding before his eyes had even his mouth dropping wide open. It was utter chaos. Any semblance of order had dissipated as soon as the missing nin from Mist drew his sword. Civilians were screaming and scrambling to distance themselves, while a scattered few in the crowd were drawing hidden blades and struggling to reach the procession. From what Jiraiya had been able to see, it looked as though a group of ninja had attacked the guards standing around the daimyo's sedan chair. While the guards were distracted, a group of 4 civilian children swooped onto the sedan chair in front. It was at this point that Jiraiya realized they probably weren't as innocent as they looked and pulled out a pair of children before running off with them. Jiraiya was now in a quandary. Should he interfere? And if so, which side? The supposed kidnappers or those who had been keeping the daimyo hostage? His gut was tugging him in the direction of the daimyo's sedan chair. As a cloud of black smoke suddenly burst beside him, the level of screaming around him elevated to even higher heights, but Jiraiya could tell it was harmless. He decided to trust it. It was, after all, what had kept him alive all these years. Leaping strongly into the air, Jiraiya headed directly for the daimyo's sedan chair, and as he did so, immediately, he could tell that something was off. The smoke must have been a signal for them to retreat, for the various ninja that had been attacking were now trying to flee. But even as he watched, the one named Zabuza knocked out a black-haired boy with a swing of his blade and then reached out to grab a thin woman who slumped in his grasp. There were 2 cloaked figures beside him, one holding an older man and a struggling young girl in each hand, the other exchanging blows with what appeared to be a shinobi wearing the pt.8. Now that Jiraiya was close enough to see, he knew immediately who he was facing. The masked one was Kakazu. The other one was not a familiar face to Jiraiya, but judging from his black cloak, was a member of Akatsuki as well. Jiraiya-sama. The shinobi, who Jiraiya suddenly recognized as one of the Leaf's jonin, cried out, "Is that really you?" Leaning forward, Jiraiya thrust out his hand and struck a pose. "Yes, it is I. Jiraiya, the great toad sage and best-selling author of Icha Icha." Zabuza turned toward him. "So you're one of the legendary Sannin, Jiraiya." He released the woman he'd been holding. Falling to the ground, she scampered away. The man beside Kakazu looked interested. "A Sannin? As much as I'd like to get the bounty on your head, Sannin," said Kakazu. "I have no interest in fighting you today. Some other time, perhaps." He jerked his head at the other man, who scowled widely. Zabuza stepped back to the sedan chair to grab a frightened-looking man in fancy robes. "Some other time, you say?" said Jiraiya. "That'll be difficult, seeing as how you'll be dead." End of chapter 22.